I wanted to take just a second to welcome you to this discussion series. We were all delighted to see that there was such interest in this topic of grassroots community engaged investment. We, as Transform Finance, have been working on the idea of centering community voices in community investments and in impact investment, in community development for a long time. And this discussion series is a culmination of a few years of work that have gotten us to, as we'll discuss, to look at what is the current practice now, what are the needs, and where we can go. We do want to make this really quite interactive. We want to hear from you, what you think, what you have seen, what might work. And so, yeah, we'll keep our presentation relatively short. And then we're hoping that you will jump in. You can write your questions at any time in the chat, and then we will collate them. You can also send them just to the panelists if you want, and we'll make sure to pick them up there as well. So my name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the executive director at Transform Finance. We're a nonprofit that works at the intersection of finance and social justice. And I am joined today by my colleague, Kurt Lyon, that is also my co-author on the report that we recently issued on grassroots community engaged investing, and by Aditi Vaidya, who is a longtime collaborator and co-conspirator of Transform Finance, and is a senior program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Aditi was seminal in getting this work underway, and has been also involved in this space for a long time. So we thought it would make sense to start by having Aditi walk us through a little bit of her perspective, how she and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation are coming to this work. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Aditi now. And she will be talking to us about, this idea of community power, how it fits with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's priorities around health equity, and how this all fits in with the idea of capital in communities. Thank you, Aditi. Over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. It's really nice to see all of your names and hopefully faces soon on the Zoom. It's just my pleasure, real pleasure to be here. We're happy to have supported this project and Transform Finance as part of our learning into various strategies and tools used to organize and build power that advance racial and health equity. So as Andrea said, I'd like to give you a sense of who we are at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the journey that we've been on the past few years that has really helped us understand what community power is and why power is important to advancing health, and how community power can be accelerated through community capital. I'll share what led us to fund Transform Finance and some of our takeaways from their great work and other research that we've been funding about how community power and organizing helps to change conditions in local communities. So as you can see on this slide, we've been around for almost 50 years. The first 30 or so, we focused on issues of health, healthcare, social services, and public health. And over that time, we were addressing the health disparities between different demographic populations and geographies. We worked primarily with the nonprofits and researchers and government agencies that undergird efforts to promote health and access to healthcare. One example of our early accomplishments was to create the 911 system. And over time since then, we, both the foundation and the health field, have come to understand the social and economic determinants of health, unpack how inequities like racism, sexism, and ableism are among those that are structural and systemic in nature, and therefore need to be addressed at the structural level. To that end, we shifted our North Star to focus on health equity and dismantling structural racism. Our definition of health equity is here on this slide. And as you can see, we name that health equity requires removing obstacles or barriers to health, and we explicitly name powerlessness as one of those barriers. We came to realize that we will never make a difference in addressing disparities unless we prioritize getting at the root causes of racial inequities. So initially, to address powerlessness, we supported researchers, healthcare, and public health professionals to engage the voice and leadership of communities. those with the highest rates of negative health outcomes, presumably mostly low-income communities and communities of color, as we know. We did this because we have long believed that community engagement is critical to advancing health and well-being. But through our own assessments and evaluations, we have come to discover that engagement is insufficient to sustaining the work of communities to take action and to drive change. More recently, we're learning that community organizing and power building is what is really helping to demand and create that change. Next slide, please. One of our areas of focus at the foundation is on place. We know that where we live has a profound impact on our health, and that importantly for our discussion today, disinvestment and discriminatory practices and policies have excluded low-income people and people of color from social and economic opportunity, which has led to gaps in health. To address these gaps, in the past, we funded organizing efforts around issues ranging from tobacco control to ACA implementation, and realized that supporting community mobilization is important to advocacy, but that communities organize to build power beyond any one issue. We've learned that communities have a vision for their future, create multi-issue agendas that include the type of housing they want to see in their neighborhoods, the ways they would like their neighborhoods to be built, and the kinds of jobs that support local and regional economies. We also know that there are many ways to build community power to address these gaps in health. There are some strategies that are designed to fight against policies and practices that are harmful to our communities, and other community power strategies that leverage capital to seed very practical projects leading to community ownership and increased community investment in jobs, housing, care, and much more. This is one of the reasons we were excited to support this research project to understand how community investment and power relate to one another. So our learning journey at the foundation, moving from prioritizing disparities to structural change, from community engagement to community power, was especially helpful this past year. With the pandemic and its economic repercussions, the structural and systemic inequities that it surfaced, and in the wake of the racial uprisings responding to state-sanctioned violence of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, we have seen community power show up in so many ways that we were able to take this learning and new relationships with community organizing groups to respond. But there is still so much that needs to be done. Next slide. So to give you a sense of how we got here, one of the initiatives that contributed to our learning about power was called Lead Local. It was a 24-month program with essentially 3 major goals: to understand how power operates in place, to understand how to measure and track the impacts of base building, a core aspect of community power building, and to create a shared understanding of how community power helps to inform conditions for racial and health equity. One of the unstated objectives of Lead Local was to start creating a bridge between community power, social justice, and health equity to align around our shared values and goals and to maximize change. Until recently, these have been disparate sectors, with public health advocates shining a light on why community voice matters, while community power building groups are shaping conversations fundamentally about health, but one not working together and even knowing each other in many cases. So the result of Lead Local was really to visibilize the field of community organizing and power building, both to us at RWJ and to health advocates. Visibilizing meant learning together about diverse strategies and infrastructure, the contours of grassroots organizing and community power building, and opportunities to influence impact. But one common recommendation across all the grantee reports in Lead Local was to invest in community power building. And we see capital investment as one important type of investment to support community power. Next slide, please. So here are some of the findings. The University of Southern California's Equity Research Institute partnered with the other grantees and field partners to look across 16 cities and states. The top line findings are here. And note, these may seem obvious to many of you, but they were really important for us to document. The program helped to build evidence that power building is a critical lever to seeing systemic change in communities. Some of the findings that you can see here are that strategies and capacities are inextricably linked to place, that power has multiple dimensions, that community power is not just a way to achieve other outcomes like policy or seeing change in our neighborhoods, but is an outcome in and of itself, and that base building and organizing are foundational to what power building is. Next slide, please. The other big result of Lead Local was a field-driven definition of power, which you can see here is really centered on base building. And this will help us measure how our future work to support community power enhances health and racial equity. Next slide. Thanks. So all the research and learning are on this website, leadlocal.org. We developed lots of tools that are being used by the field. The one I wanted to point out to all of you for our discussion is a primer on structural change, because I think we really saw that structural change is the ultimate goal of community power, but how that happens was important for us to unpack. So that primer might be useful to you. Ultimately, I think what I want to talk about is how these Lead Local lessons explicitly relate to community decision-making related to investment. Next slide. Through Lead Local, but also Transform Finance's research in this project, we see an ecosystem of different types of organizations and approaches to advancing racial and health equity. This one is depicted kind of like a 1960s flower power. So if you'll go with me with that image, as you can see, one of the important pillars of the ecosystem is strategic community investment. And as with most ecosystems, different strategies must work together to be effective. In the case of power building, they must be accountable to a base of people. And you can see in the ecosystem that there are a lot of other functions that I'm sure many of us fund as well: policy advocacy, legal work, coalitions and alliances. Next slide. Thanks. So to sum up, these are our major kind of insights into why community power and community investment are critical to advancing racial equity. That power obviously helps to fight policies that are harmful to our communities, but that power is also important to leverage capital to seed very practical projects in our communities. One of the other key findings from Transform Finance's research was the fact that there are a range of ways that residents are engaging in projects to shape community investment. Building power is on one end of a spectrum of engagement strategies, as you'll hear from Andrea and the team. Currently, community power is not the main objective of most community investment, but the fact that community power can be strengthened through projects that leverage capital is important. That means that we in philanthropy can help to play a very important role and consider ways to leverage both grant making and impact capital in ways that advance community power building. I'll leave it there for now. We're really looking forward to our discussion together, and I'll turn it back over to you, Andrea.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Aditi, for this context setting and for all the work that you have done supporting the idea really of changing the discourse around power in communities, creating agency, having accountability. And those that have followed Transform Finance for a while might not be surprised to see us involved in this space. Whereas it's always a matter of saying, yes, all capital has an impact on communities. We can do a lot better and we can go a lot deeper, frankly, than what has been done so far in the impact space writ large, in mission investments, but in particular in this context of community development and investments in communities. And why is this? Well, because community investments, while they have played a very important role, have not quite fully achieved the goal that one might see for them of really empowering communities, giving them the tools and the supplementing what is falling short, whether from the public sector or from the private sector. So even when mission is at the core of community investments, there is still farther that one can go. And this has come up very much to the forefront in the last few years with the work, for example, of Edgar Villanueva with decolonizing philanthropy, I think it was. I might forget the name right now. But also with a broader effort towards participatory processes, including participatory grant making and general, participatory budgeting, and generally really increasing the democratization of decision-making processes. This is coming from communities themselves asking for it, all the more so in the context of the racial justice uprising over the last few years. But also it's coming from funders that are reckoning with the practices and with the way in which they hold power. While this practice has been going on for a long time, right, this feeds into a long-standing tradition of community self-determination. It hasn't quite been brought together. And really what we did here was an attempt at saying, what are all the practices that we see emerging that are getting at this point of increasing the amount of agency in community and also using the process itself of investment as a way of creating power. And this is perhaps one of the most fundamental points in the research and in the approach that we're taking. Would love to hear all your thoughts on this, that this is not just about the outcomes of investments in communities, whether it's the number of affordable housing units or the amount of capital that is allocated to entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs of color that previously did not or now do not have access to that capital, right? That is one of the outcomes, but the process itself, using that process as a way of creating agency in the community, as a way of increasing the accountability of investors, is one of the fundamental things that we saw here. So the process matters, and for outside institutions, whether they are philanthropic funders or investors or intermediaries, such as community development finance institutions, GCEI, this Grassroots Community Engaged Investment model that we're focusing on here, serves this goal of really embedding equity into investment processes. Equity as a value that I imagine many on this call are sympathetic to, if not necessarily like embedding in every practice. So what is quickly this grassroots community engaged investment practice that we talk about? Again, it's not a subset, right? It's not a carve out. It's really a lens or a process or a practice that one can apply to all investments in order to ensure that there is meaningful input, there is decision making is being transferred, and that grassroots communities and other stakeholders are allowed to participate both in setting their own priorities and their own future, and in having an ownership stake where possible. As we'll see on this, where possible, it's really a matter of a continuum, right, of practices that are moving in that direction. Now, one important thing on this is, why do we call it grassroots community engaged investment? Community, probably self-explanatory in this case. Grassroots, because we wanted to think and emphasize this idea of distributed, accountable, broad participatory processes, right? Where you don't just have a couple of folks from the community that are making decisions on behalf of the community, but really where there is both a broad voice and one that has accountability to the community at large. And in terms of focusing on the grassroots stakeholders, the idea is that we want to decenter investors from the investment, right? Investors are one of the very fundamental ingredients, but this is about the community. So we wanted very much, even in the name of this work, to center the notion of the community here. Little bit of a quick background for what we did. This was multiple years of research. We spoke to over 100 grassroots organizations, but also investors, funders, other field builders, in order to end up with some 20 projects that we featured here across the country, as you will see soon, that have they've really started to experiment with this, sometimes in coordination, sometimes just as innovations. We saw that there is a focus on the depth of the engagement, right? Many are familiar with the idea of consulting with communities or engaging communities. That has in itself led, as we have seen, to some sort of engagement fatigue from communities that see their voice being called in, but then not reflected in what ultimately happens. So they're moving past that point of more surface type of engagement. we saw that this can come across in a variety of forms, whether it's communities deciding on specific investments or setting mission criteria over some investments. That we saw that also carving out anything that has to do with grants, that there was a broad variety in what these community groups and deep community engaged processes were doing. So we've seen real estate projects, we have seen housing as well as commercial real estate. We have seen some mixed interventions through capital funds that really take a holistic approach to deploying capital in communities, as well as more traditional enterprise financing, again, where the allocation goes to local entrepreneurs. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and co-author, Kurt Lyon, that will walk us through some of the key features of the projects that we have analyzed, the goals, and a few more bits, and then we'll turn it over to discussion. So thank you, Kurt.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So happy to be here talking to y'all. Wish I could see you in the little boxes up there. Maybe next time we can open it up so we can see each other's faces a bit more. Yeah, so I'm happy to jump into some of the findings from the research and conversations we had. First, I just want to say that a lot of this work is just lifting up the work that others are doing on the ground. So I want to thank all the interviewees for the project research, other folks who helped us with research and writing and taking a look and just having conversations. This is really a culmination of lots of different conversations that brought us here today. So when talking about GCEI, we kind of had developed a few core characteristics or features that we really wanted to zoom into to kind of describe the ways in which grassroots stakeholders are being involved in these processes. The initiation of a project and how the goal is set for a project is a really important distinction to be made. Some projects that we looked at are started by foundations, say Market Creek Plaza is a place-based foundation, the Jacobs Family Foundation that kind of started this real estate development project and brought in community members to help define that project. Some projects are started from the bottom up, from community organizers, folks coming together and saying we want to control how capital is being deployed. That's seen a lot of the community capital funds we looked at. It's a very important distinction, but probably the most important factor, regardless of who initiates the project, is who gets to set the goal and the priorities of a project, and making sure that that is aligned with broader community goals. So whether it's tenants' rights or just working class folks who need affordable housing, making sure that in a housing investment that those terms are meeting the needs of a specific community. That's really important. So you have some projects where funders or outside investors are initiating a project, but are still really capturing that community voice in that goal setting stage. We have this term voice and vote, which we kind of separate into the design and governance stages. That really is just saying that there is a lot of decisions to be made around these kinds of investment projects, and also how they are being how the project is being put together. So what is the DNA of the project that we like to say? Who's designing that DNA, how it's operating, what that structure looks like, and who's participating in that. And then once the project is launched, what does the ongoing governance look like? Who controls the operations? What partners are being brought in, and how are those partners being held accountable? There are some projects where there's community development financial institutions, grassroots organizations, foundations kind of all working together and governing how capital is being deployed. But some kind of accountability mechanisms are put in place so that those outside institutions are really working for the grassroots members. A good example of that is the Real People's Fund, where a bunch of grassroots organizations are partnering with CDFI called Community Division, and how that fund is being governed and how the loans are being underwritten. Lastly, we have economic participation here. So that's who's benefiting from the economic value. Is there a community investment component? A lot of the projects we see in our report do have community investment. What's really important there is that that should often be coupled with governance, like real decision making, if that community alignment is going to be able to happen. Investment without that is great and allows local investment, allows people to participate in their local economy in a different way. But those projects that have investments coupled with governance and decision making really have a deeper and long lasting impact from that power building lens. Next slide, Andrea. So we make a distinction between two different types of goals in these projects, wealth and power building. We think of wealth building as kind of traditional community development goals, like income, job creation, mitigating forms of extraction and the racial wealth gap. Those are really core to a lot of these projects and look very similar to a lot of non-community engaged projects. Uniquely, there's also some, like I mentioned, some community investment components, and also this idea of taking real estate off the market for real estate projects. So some kind of decommodification, as we call it. And that's kind of a unique way of retaining wealth within a given community. But what really makes GCEI special is focusing, like Aditi was talking about early on, about building power. So we have this quote on what that looks like. So bringing in social justice movements into conversations around capital, forging connections between grassroots and institutional stakeholders, building community knowledge around local economic development ecosystems, and funding projects that are entwined with existing movements in the community. All those factors kind of contribute to longer lasting kind of second order effects. So like Andrea was saying, not just what the investment looks like, not just a business or a new real estate development, but really the process of getting there, how that leads to long lasting relationships, skills, and networks in a given community that helps set them up for more projects like this in the future, and help support existing goals in the community that could be on the policy front, on the advocacy front, on the community organizing front. It's really integrated into those other very important pieces. Andrea, you can skip 2 slides, I think, when I get to the next piece. So yeah, here we have a map of the projects we featured in the report. Importantly, these are not all of the projects out there that are exhibiting Grassroots Community Engaged Investment. These are the ones that we just happen to highlight in the report. And like Andrea said, it's very important to mention, what we didn't look at. So a lot of projects that are just focusing on grant capital or government grants. So we're really focusing on the finance, like return seeking investments as the area of research here. So how are communities taking ownership over those processes, as well as projects that are seeking the kind of like community ownership that is not just consultative, so having real decision-making roles. So that's kind of some important criteria for how we got to these projects. Here is a table of these projects. So we broke it down into these broad categories. So there's some community investment pools. These are pools of capital for kind of general use or use for many different types of strategies. So we have community capital funds like the Boston Ujima Project and Real People's Fund that are really focused on supporting enterprises and worker-owned co-ops. There's some projects like Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation and Elevated Chicago, which are focusing kind of in more traditional community development strategies. So in place-based real estate, infrastructure projects, kind of a variety of different ways to develop their community in a community-controlled manner. There's a lot of other real estate development projects, and that can be at the neighborhood level. Kensington Corridor Trust is a project that is buying up properties in a whole neighborhood in the commercial corridor, and having the community decide the use for those buildings. And then on a single project level, we have projects like Downtown Crenshaw and East Portland Community Investment Trust, which are focusing on single developments and how communities can invest in those projects, determine what kind of businesses they're going to bring in and how that is being used for the community itself. We have a few projects that are focusing on housing, particularly on community ownership and multi-stakeholder ownership over land in the buildings where people are living on that land. East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is in the Bay Area and focusing on having this very complex multi-stakeholder governance over housing investments. And Rock USA at the national level has a conversion process for manufactured home communities into cooperative ownership. And lastly, we have kind of a catch-all category for impact investment funds that are operating at very different scales with different strategies. There's regional funds like Invest Appalachia at the national level, the Olamina Fund and Sea Commons are in very different ways engaging communities over how they are funding other intermediaries and businesses. And the Boston Impact Initiative Fund is a place-based fund in Boston. So next slide. And I'll pass this over to Andrea for the investment piece.
Thank you, Kurt. Yeah, I just wanted to say one quick thing here before we turn it over to Q&A. And thanks to those that have already dropped questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. We'll turn to that in a second. So because we are intentionally centering the lens of the community, I did want to end by talking for a second about the role of the investor and how investors come into this. There is, which is often a starting point for many, there is an investment case from doing this deep community engagement and having much more deeply participatory processes. And this goes to the fact that communities know what works for them. Community knows what they need and what they might want, what has been done in the past, and oftentimes in projects in community that have failed because they have not taken into account the community vision and the community voices. But while there is this investment case to be made, really in terms of the risking, in terms of the aligning with the market fit, as it were, we really think that this boils down to a values-driven approach, right? A belief in self-determination, a belief in agency. We started this work by looking at the disability rights movement concept of nothing about us without us. That should apply to communities writ large. And also a mission-driven approach that if you are a foundation in particular, right, the idea of creating agency, creating power in these communities may indeed be one of the ways in which you are moving towards your mission. So it would fit within a mission-related investment bucket or a program-related investment bucket as well. So again, this doesn't mean that all decisions must be turned over to the community from the get-go. In fact, one of the important determinants of success is this collaborative aspect and the technical assistance, right? This doesn't mean that communities have all of a sudden to become underwriters of projects, but having that voice, having that control over the mission, is this something that we want to see in our communities is absolutely crucial from what we've seen. Now, might this mean that timelines get expanded? Might this mean that some of the projects will have to be smaller for starters than, say, what many CDFIs are used to underwriting? Yes, it can also change the traditional notion of risk-adjusted returns. But if we're honestly meaning that we're doing this work for the benefit of the community, if this is really to be mission investment, then we should be willing and eager, in fact, to wrestle with those questions and think, well, who is in the best position to bear the risk, rather than how much return can I maximize for the type of risk that I'm taking. And this is especially important, I think, in the cases where communities themselves are part of the investment process, as we see in the Boston GMA project, for example, where community members become investors themselves, or in Market Creek Plaza. It is fundamental to think that this doesn't mean that risk is now being placed unduly on the communities, right? Are community members really in the best position to bear it? Or might there be in the stack a role for philanthropic funders, for example, to play a de-risking role or take a first loss position in the investments? So there is a lot of work to be done there, and that's a bit what we would like to explore with you in this conversation, as well in the rest of this discussion series. There will be 6 more sessions in which we dive into some of the specific models, the roles for investors and philanthropists, and also how communities and community leadership can get started thinking about playing a role in aggregating and deploying capital themselves. So with that, I would love to turn it over to you all for some Q&A and discussion. And yeah, please do put them in the chat, and we'll address some of them in turn. Aditi, Kurt, please feel free to jump in on any of them. And we can, some of them are coming through just to the panelists, so we'll consolidate them and handle them in that way. Maybe, Kurt, we can start with the question that came in from Mark. How early should organizations think about governance, and how should they approach that at different phases of the organization or the project's journey?
Yeah, that's a super important question. I think broadly what we see resonating most with the grassroots stakeholders and communities that are involved in these processes is that the earlier that governance is transferred over, the better, and the more that they are able to craft that goal and the project direction and make sure that that is going to align with the broader goals of the community. And there are some really clear examples of projects that are initiated, or at least kind of started in conjunction with either philanthropy or investors, where that transfer happens really early on. A great example is the Real People's Fund in the East Bay, where the Solidago Foundation in particular was very integral in the project's founding, but very early on was kind of like setting up a process where a few of the grassroots partners could really define what the fund governance is going to look like, what partners they bring in to help the fund actually operate from a financial perspective, but still maintaining that community governance. So that was kind of like a hands-off approach to having that community ownership start very early on. Of course, there are some cases where it makes sense for an investor or a funder to kind of jump on the opportunity. Say, if a real estate lot goes on the market, putting up that capital upfront because there's kind of a time sensitivity aspect to it, but then bringing in grassroots organizations and residents as soon as feasible to make sure that governance happens.
Thank you, Kurt, for that. And I'll turn next to a few of the questions that I think are getting to the same theme around accessibility to non-accredited investors, limitations around blue sky laws, and kind of barriers to community investment. And I think it's important to clarify, first of all, that a lot of what counts as grassroots community engaged investment doesn't necessarily require that the community members themselves put in capital into the projects, right? We wanted to really highlight from the work that we have seen in the field that in many cases, the project is trying to break down a little bit the link that is made between, oh, I am an investor in terms of putting in capital, therefore I have the right to opine on the project, right? Even as known investors, we wanted to make sure that we're looking at where power can be created there. And this means that in some cases there is no problem in terms of laws that regulate investments from non-accredited investors or blue sky laws and the like. I know that in some cases, such as in the Boston Ujima project, they took advantage of a local exemption. In California, with Market Creek Plaza that has been mentioned before, there was a long process with the California securities regulators to do this community-style IPO that allow community residents to jump in, and those barriers generally are getting to be less strong than they have historically been. So it seems promising in terms of non-accredited local investors being able to put in some of the capital themselves. But in some of the bigger projects where we're talking about, multi-million-dollar developments, oftentimes it is outside capital, right, where some of the governance is being given over to the communities. Now, in that context, I think we can touch on one of the other questions about, how to get beyond the fear of losing control to communities. One can look at the example of the Heron Foundation. There's really been a pioneer in this space, where they don't come at it from the place of fear, they come at it from the place of stewardship over their own assets, in saying, well, we are investing in these communities. We want to center their voices, and we want to create power as part of this process, as they have been doing in California, I believe, in the Central Valley. If we're tying it to the legal questions around blue sky laws, it is true that in some cases we have spoken with philanthropic funders in their investor capacity who say, well, don't I have a problem with fiduciary duty if I am turning over investment decisions to the community? It might be that there is a need to do a little bit of legal maneuver in there. However, fiduciary duty concerns have often served as a screen or a smoke screen not to do the type of community engagement and not to turn over the investment decisions. So I would encourage us all to push back against the idea of fiduciary duty as a real obstacle to things.
Andrea, I might share some thoughts in response to this question too about how to get beyond fears. What I spoke about was how this project is connected to our overarching work around power, but there's also a move in the foundation to learn more about how we can think about community development finance and impact capital, and the urgency that the current times we're in have created have actually led both the program side of the foundation as well as the investment side of the foundation to really think more critically about how to marry the two sets of goals on the program and capital sides. So I think there are opportunities there because of the sense of urgency that power leads you to one set of conclusions of why we should be doing something like this and learn more about it. And the urgency around the state of economic injustice and inequality right now also leads you to a similar conclusion. So I say that because I'm happy to share more about the overarching learning we're doing around impact capital that I think is helping to connect dots between capital investments and racial inequity, which is, as you might remember, is still part of the journey that we're on in our learning. But kind of connecting it to a broader vision and set of values, I think, has helped move beyond initial fears. I think the practicalities of particular projects still raise certain risk questions and concern, but it's grounded in this understanding that we want to be solutions oriented. So I think that's really helpful.
Great, thank you so much, Aditi, for the additional elucidation. I see a question from Jennifer, maybe we can touch on this a little bit more, Kurt. Can you talk about the different ways and types of power building that you have seen? Indeed, there are multiple approaches to power that we saw in this project. So yeah, can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And that's a really good question. And I think that probably each of the individual projects who are doing this work would probably answer that a little bit differently in terms of how they see their work integrating with shifting power dynamics in their context. But one interesting, not necessarily split, but two themes that we see is a kind of like distributed power building. So bringing in lots and lots of people into a process that involves skill building, that involves really kind of like financial education or politicization, like popular education in the context of a project. So an example there is the Boston Ujima project, which definitely does this, I think the most out of all these projects, where they're bringing in hundreds and hundreds of community members in Boston to learn about the fund, to use the fund as like a locus for talking about all these other things in their communities and how capital is a critical component to all the existing movements, and really focusing on that skill building. And from their perspective, that kind of manifests in terms of like greater civic engagement, greater focus on some of the economic issues on businesses, capital, those sorts of things that are kind of different from a lot of traditional community development projects that don't bring in a wide group of folks. And on the flip side, there's also this pattern of having groups of organizations kind of gaining more political clout through this investment work. So when small organizations or kind of community-facing organizations are engaging with new actors, CDFIs, new foundations, other kind of like civic society groups, that is actually creating a new area for them to express the demands of the communities that they are representing, to use new sources of capital. So organizations that previously may have just been funded through traditional social justice grants and foundation portfolios are now gaining access to other buckets of capital within institutional philanthropy and also maybe CDFI dollars. So forming those new channels and relationships on an organizational level rather than kind of a broad individual level is another form of power, because that is creating new relationships that can be built upon for change in the future. So that's just one thematic difference we've seen in how power can be built, but there's kind of a whole spectrum in between, and every project is doing it in a different way.
Great, thank you for that, Kurt. I want to combine a couple of the questions. There was one on from Claire Strawn on how a community can launch a grassroots community investment infrastructure, and another from Troy Rothman on the tension of the timeline of doing things the GCEI way, as he puts it. I like that. I like that phrase. One thing, and I'll turn this over to Aditi, if you don't mind addressing in particular Troy's piece. We have seen that there are some determinants of success in terms of the community readiness. And I think that goes to Claire's question. For example, again, in the case of the Boston Ujima project that many of you are most familiar with, there have been years of local organizing on the ground before the project started, right? So this was an offshoot of deep community organizing and strong relationships and trust locally. In other cases, we have seen that one of the determining factors is the pre-existence of a bit of an ecosystem that might include a CDFI, a community foundation, as well as strong grassroots community organizations that have trust and that have already some of the relationships, as in the case of the Real People's Fund, formerly known as the Democratizing Capital East Bay project that Kurt mentioned before. And in other cases, this really starts as a bottom-up approach of saying, hey, you know, there is an issue here. This is a very hot real estate market where the properties are all being taken up by speculators. What do we do? How do we organize from that standpoint? And what matters to us, I think, is that whatever the process is at the beginning, that it reflect this broad views of the community, right? They not be something that is decided for the community or imposed from the outside. Yeah, Aditi, can you address Troy's question from your experience in this?
Sure. I'm also looking at some of the other questions that have come in since then that I think are related to one aspect. If I wanted to address your question, Troy, I think that what we've started to see since we've been working with Transform Finance and doing our own learning on community power is that the tension there in many communities, there are efforts underway already. And I think Kurt and Andrea can speak to that in terms of the projects that were part of this research project, where community organizing, power building was already underway. Those efforts needed grant making. They needed resourcing of different types to be able to scale and support grassroots organizing, which is part of the reason we wanted to share how this fits into community power. Because one way to approach this is that if you have a stronger ecosystem of a variety of ways that communities are coming together, organizing and building power through multiple organizations, through different forms, that creates kind of the grounding, the soil to be able to then seed community development and grapple with this tension of timeline that does become difficult in places where you don't have organized communities and or communities that are engaging with one another in different ways. So that's one thing that I think is important, kind of one of the things that led us to this project with Transform Finance was that we knew that this ecosystem needs to be supported. The other, I think, partly to your question, Nora, about kind of the pre-existing conditions is our understanding, and part of the reason it was important for us to document and visibilize the sector of community organizing is that when you lay it on top of Transform Finance, all of your work, we see that there is a mixed set of stories, right? That in some cases there are pre-existing organizations. In some other cases, capital projects actually help to seed organizations, help to seed the ability for communities to come together, and that I don't know that there are cons to either approach. I think I leave it to Kurt and Andrea, to your research, to know what the differences were. But I think part of what we know as funders who do also support power building and organizing, that the mix is actually important. And it's important to think about a range of entities, formations that support stakeholders to come together. And so it's not stagnant on the community power building side, just as it's not stagnant on the community development side. So I think that's why grant making and capital and program and investment in the foundation world, really the more we can work together, the better.
Yeah, thanks, Aditi. Just to jump in really quickly on that idea of who is the community and how are they organized. That definitely differs across all the projects. We're going to be talking about that very specifically. We have a session later in the series that really focuses on how grassroots and the more bottom up models decided how to do those very things. So definitely a plug for that future session. But it definitely, rather than pro and con, I would see it as a trade-off. And there are some real realities to that. Having a lot of people voting on decisions, yes, it can be slower, hard to get people to come to the table, whereas it's faster if it's a smaller group of organizations. But these decisions were very conscious by the community leaders who are putting the governance models together. And I think that's really the important part. And it's also important why we should learn from the projects that are doing the work and creating different models and experimenting, really, because some might work better in some context than another. And I think that is shaping up now with some of the difficulties that some of the projects are having, and also some of the challenges in having a big group come together, or to have a small group that is tied to a community in some way, but in some projects, those few stakeholders might not be representative. That's another risk of having a smaller group of people or organizations doing that leadership.
Thank you both for all that. And I will add that, yeah, the timeline is one of the things that can get expanded and can get complicated. But we have also heard in some projects that the very fact, for example, of communities getting to vote over the allocation of capital could, if not done intentionally and properly, lead to unintended consequences of creating strife in the community, right? So there are multiple layers here of intentionality, and there is not one system that works for all. However, we will explore in the next session on the 17th some of the decisions that have been made in different communities as to how to do this. And why a certain process was better for one or another. And as you will hear there, for some groups, they said, well, we don't care if it's slower. We don't care if we deploy less capital. What is important to us is this economic democracy process, right? That is one of the goals that trumps all the other goals that we will see. And so for the questions around the challenges, including Hannah's question around, well, how do you ensure that voices are included, that this is not in itself a process that marginalizes some voices? There are some great learnings from Spark microgrants that we relied on in the international development context, on size of group, for example, that would be a best fit, or just in terms of process for inclusion of more voices. So for many of those that we have not been able to tackle today, again, I'll remind you, this was just the most basic grounding presentation in a series of 7. So I would like to encourage you all to join us for the remainder of this series, and of course to contact us offline for the for any questions or comments that you have. This is the beginning. This is not the end of a process. We really put out this report, massive as it is, as a way of starting to kind of define and shape this field, so that philanthropic funders and others can support it, can help it grow, can share the learnings that there are, and ultimately, solve some of these pain points that you all have been bringing up. And I'll turn it over to Aditi for a final comment. But in terms of supporting the field together, I do want to leave you all with this idea that there is a role to be played for philanthropic funders here, and not saying, oh, these projects are too small, or this is unknown, or it's too complicated. There is a reason to support these efforts, not to exclude them. For investors to question some of their limitations, whether it's around risk, as Helen asked, and who gets to define it, what kind of risk are we in a position to take, and why do we really not want to take it? For CDFIs to think about how they can go smaller on the ticket if that's what is needed, as opposed to trying to fit community investments into their own needs. And for communities, there are exploring, like, how do we get started on this, or how do we move towards more depth in projects that are already happening. So do join us for the next discussion, and continue to engage with us. We want to figure out how we also can support all your work, regardless of which stakeholder group you're sitting in. So Aditi.
I'll just close by saying thank you. I just feel like there's so many great questions in the chat and in the Q&A. We're just getting started. We know this always happens at the end of an hour, that we're just getting juicy, and we want to now have a meal or drinks together. So hopefully the future events will all be able to continue and pick up right where we left off. I'll just say that it's been a real pleasure and honor to work with Vaidya, Kurt, and the team at Transform Finance. I'm so glad this has been seeding some important questions and conversations. And we're right along with you all who are participating on this journey. We're trying to figure this out as well. So I look forward to engaging with you all in future events too. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aditi, for all your work in this space. Thanks to all the projects also that have spoken with us and have done such tremendous, innovative and hard work concretely. We just talk about it. So I want to recognize all the work that that has been done. Do join us on the 17th. You will find the information there. Contact us, info@transformfinance.org, and on our website under the GCEI banner, you will find more information. So thank you for joining and engaging with us. We have jotted down all the questions that we didn't get to, and we'll make sure to address them in the upcoming events in this series. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you again for joining.
Thanks, Al.